Before we jump into this amazing story, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? I love seeing just how far these tales of drama and karma can travel. The afternoon sun beat down relentlessly on the quiet suburban street, casting sharp shadows against the beige house with brick trim. A faint breeze stirred the leaves of the meticulously trimmed hedges, carrying the distant hum of lawnmowers and the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog. From the front of the house, a sound like a gunshot shattered the mundane calm, a high-pitched crash, metal screeching, and the unmistakable shattering of glass. In the driveway, a gray Toyota SUV stood crippled, its windshield marred by a large gray satellite dish that had somehow driven itself through the center. Shards of green-tinted safety glass glittered across the hood and pavement like cruel confetti thrown by fate. Leaning slightly back, hands gripping his hips, the man who owned the house laughed uncontrollably. His dark gray polo shirt was slightly rumpled, jeans dusted with debris from earlier yard work. Yet nothing about his appearance suggested the chaos unfolding just meters away. At 38, he was no stranger to confrontation, though nothing in his past had prepared him for the audacity of the women standing across from him. Their faces were painted with disbelief and anger, a mixture that would have been comical if not for the sheer audacity of the situation. One of them, Susan, her round face framed by streaks of blonde hair, buried her hands in her cheeks, eyes wide, mouth trembling. Beside her, Lauren's floral blouse clung tightly against her middle-aged frame, her shorts creased for movement as she pointed furiously at the man, shouting in frustration that only seemed to fuel his laughter further. The dish had fallen from the roof, from the very edge where it had been mounted on the house, without causing any trouble for years. That Susan and Lauren had climbed up there without permission to remove it was an affront he could not overlook. It wasn't the dish itself, it was the principle. He had endured months of petty complaints from the sisters, their self-appointed role as neighborhood enforcers, their obsession with HOA rules that never seemed to apply to themselves. They had scolded him for minor infractions, the wrong flower pot alignment, a mailbox they deemed unsightly, a lawn slightly overgrown after a rare vacation. Each time he had tried diplomacy, but each time they had returned with increased arrogance, their entitlement growing like a weed that refused to be uprooted. 2 days earlier, the confrontation had begun. He had been in his garage, checking the wiring on the satellite connection, when he had heard the creak of the ladder outside. Looking up through the garage window, he had seen Susan and Lauren clambering onto the roof, determined to remove the dish themselves. He had run outside, hands raised in a mix of caution and anger, shouting for them to stop. "This is private property. You can't just," but Susan had laughed, her voice carrying across the quiet street, dripping with condescension. "Oh, we're just doing what's best for the neighborhood. You wouldn't want the HOA on our backs, would you?" Lauren had added her own cutting remark, rolling her eyes, as if his presence was a minor inconvenience to their grand mission. He had tried to reason, had reminded them of common decency and legal boundaries, but their response had been a smirk and a dismissive wave. It was the kind of arrogance that could only be punished by fate, though he didn't know yet how. Now, standing in the aftermath, the universe, or perhaps his own improvisation, had intervened. The dish, heavy and unforgiving, had slipped from their grasp. Time seemed to stretch as he watched it arc through the air, the afternoon sun glinting off its metal surface, and he realized it was heading straight for their vehicle. For a brief, surreal second, there was silence, an almost reverent pause as if the neighborhood itself were holding its breath. Then came the crash, the shattering of glass, the metallic clang of impact. The women's expressions shifted in tandem, from triumph to horror, from confidence to disbelief. He could almost hear the mental cogs grinding in their heads as the realization hit. It wasn't the dish that had made them pause. It was their own arrogance reflected back at them, delivered in a harsh, metallic judgment. Neighbors began to stir, drawn by the noise. A couple peeked through the blinds across the street, while a man on a bicycle slowed to a stop, curiosity overriding caution. The suburban calm had been fractured, replaced by a tableau of poetic justice that felt cinematic in its precision. The man's laughter echoed, a sharp, victorious sound, though tempered by disbelief that events had unfolded so perfectly. He bent down to examine the wreckage, noting the shards of glass still clinging to the windshield frame, the dented hood, and the twisted satellite dish. It was a mess, but it was a mess that belonged, in a strange way, to the sisters. They had created the conditions. They had invited chaos by overstepping boundaries, and now they were experiencing the direct consequences. Susan's sobs grew louder, though her voice still carried notes of denial. "This isn't possible," she wailed, stepping gingerly closer to inspect the damage, her hands trembling. Lauren, more defiant, pointed a finger at him, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. You did this on purpose," she shouted, though even she could not fully mask the fear behind her accusation. It was an accusation that fell flat, for no planning had been necessary. Nature, gravity, and their own hubris had conspired to deliver this spectacle. He shook his head, still chuckling, the absurdity of the situation sinking in deeper with each passing second. "I swear," he said, voice carrying over the stunned silence of the neighborhood, "I didn't touch it. You two did all the hard work yourselves." The street was quiet once again, the immediate chaos settling like dust after a storm. Yet beneath that quiet lingered tension, anticipation, the sense that this incident was only the opening act of a much larger drama. The sisters stood frozen, a mix of shame, fury, and disbelief rooting them to the spot. The man glanced back at his roof, noting the missing shingles where the dish had once been mounted, and then at the debris on the driveway. Every detail told the story of a confrontation that had escalated far beyond the simple removal of a satellite dish. He realized, almost with glee, that the sisters had underestimated him at every turn, not because he was weak, but because they assumed that compliance was cowardice, that politeness was submission. From the sidewalk, a neighbor coughed discreetly, signaling their awareness of the spectacle. Another peeked from behind curtains, smartphone raised, perhaps capturing evidence that would later circulate in the tight-knit community. The man allowed himself a moment of reflection, a subtle grin forming as he surveyed the scene. There was satisfaction in watching justice arrive unaided, in seeing arrogance punished by its own momentum. Yet there was also an awareness that this was not the conclusion, only a dramatic punctuation mark in a story that was far from over. He would need to ensure that lessons were learned, that the sisters understood boundaries in a way they could never forget. Susan pressed her hands against the hood, her sobs stifled but persistent, while Lauren's shouts had dwindled to muttered curses, their energy spent in futile outrage. The man straightened, brushing dust from his jeans, and for a moment the suburban street seemed to hold its breath. He knew that what had just occurred was more than a random accident. It was a turning point. The balance of power in their ongoing disputes had shifted irrevocably, though how far it would go remained to be seen. The sisters had made a grave mistake, one that would have repercussions, visible and otherwise, for days to come. He stepped closer to the vehicle, his gaze fixed on the satellite dish and the web of cracks spreading across the windshield, reflecting sunlight in chaotic patterns. The metallic tang of shattered glass mixed with the scent of warm asphalt and summer air. The scene was absurd, dramatic, and perfect, like a slow-motion capture of poetic justice. And yet, he could not allow himself to revel too long. Susan and Lauren were unpredictable. Their next moves could be desperate, rash, and damaging. He needed to remain vigilant, patient, calculating. Karma had delivered the first strike, but the story was far from complete. Somewhere beneath the anger, embarrassment, and disbelief simmered their next attempt at control, their next effort to assert dominance. And he would be ready. He took a step back, hands on hips once more, surveying the chaos that had unfolded. The street was calm again, yet tension lingered like a static charge in the air. Susan's sobs and Lauren's muttered curses were the only audible sounds beyond the distant hum of suburban life. The man allowed a wry smile to form, knowing that this moment, perfect in its unexpected justice, was just the beginning. The rules had been broken, boundaries crossed, and now the reckoning had begun. He did not need to act hastily. Patience and timing were his allies. But he knew one thing with certainty. The sisters' sense of invincibility had been fractured, and nothing would be quite the same in the neighborhood again. The air seemed to thicken with anticipation as he straightened fully, eyes glinting with a mixture of amusement and resolve. Somewhere deep down, he felt the first hints of a plan forming, one that would ensure that the arrogance which had brought about this spectacle would not return unchallenged. And as the sisters glared at him, a quiet, almost imperceptible smirk crossed his face. The dish had fallen, the SUV was ruined, and for the first time, the power dynamic had shifted. But the story was far from over, and he knew the next act would demand careful calculation, clever strategy, and a touch of poetic justice. For now, he allowed himself a single deep breath, savoring the moment where chaos met consequence, and arrogance met its match. The morning after the satellite dish incident, the neighborhood hummed with cautious curiosity, neighbors whispering behind curtains and across fences. Word traveled quickly. By now, everyone knew about the gray Toyota SUV and the improbable downfall that had left it mangled in the driveway. Yet, as amusing as the scene had been, it did little to quiet the simmering tension between the man and the Karen sisters. Susan and Lauren were far from subdued. The shock of public humiliation had not softened their sense of entitlement. It had only sharpened their determination to reclaim control, to reassert the dominance they believed the HOA granted them. From the edge of his yard, the man watched them pacing in front of their damaged vehicle. Susan's hand constantly fluttered to her mouth, a gesture of worry she tried to mask as thoughtfulness, while Lauren's eyes darted around the street, scanning for witnesses to validate her outrage. He knew them well enough to recognize the signs. They were plotting, and the scale of their response would be disproportionate, driven by pride rather than reason. He remembered the countless petty disputes, the incessant reports to the HOA about trivial matters, the relentless attempts to dictate how he maintained his property. They thrived on control, and for the first time, their control had been stripped from them in a way that left the entire street watching. He began to plan, thinking through every previous encounter, every sly maneuver, every attempt at intimidation that the sisters had used. His first instinct had been to engage them directly after the dish fell, but he had learned quickly that reason was wasted on Susan and Lauren. They were relentless, unyielding, and convinced of their moral superiority. Any direct confrontation would only feed their narrative. No, he needed strategy, subtlety, and a touch of unpredictability. He spent the morning retracing their patterns, noting the times they checked neighbors' yards, when they complained to the HOA, and, crucially, their obsessive pride in their gray Toyota SUV. That pride would be their weakness. He returned to the scene where the dish had fallen, inspecting it closely. Despite the destruction it had caused, it remained a tool, a prop in a larger plan he had not yet fully executed. He considered the physics, the weight, the trajectory, the roof's pitch, and realized the potential for a controlled repeat, a way to leverage their arrogance against them. He could orchestrate the situation to ensure that any attempt by the sisters to assert dominance again would backfire spectacularly, without endangering anyone beyond the rightful target of their ego. As he worked, he also reflected on the subtle psychological edge he had gained. Susan and Lauren were accustomed to fear or compliance. Humor, patience, and clever timing were tools they had never encountered. Their rage was predictable, and their pride was blinding. If he could combine a simple mechanical setup with precise timing, he could create a scenario in which their own actions would seal their humiliation. It would require attention to detail, anticipation of their movements, and the patience to allow them to act exactly as they intended. Meanwhile, the sisters regrouped in their home across the street, phones in hand, speaking rapidly in tones he could not hear. Their expressions were taut, brows furrowed, jaws clenched. They were coordinating with each other, planning how to retaliate, how to restore their reputation, how to reassert authority over a neighborhood that had witnessed their fall. What they did not know was that he had already anticipated their next move, had considered their likely paths of action, and was ready to exploit them. Their overconfidence, their need to appear in control, was exactly what made them vulnerable. By midday, he had begun constructing a subtle but effective mechanism on his roof. It was nothing more than weights, hooks, and a controlled release point for the satellite dish. He adjusted the angles carefully, ensuring that any mishandling or rash attempt to remove it would direct the dish toward a specific, predictable path. The mechanism was unnoticeable, invisible to casual observation, and could be activated purely by the sisters' own missteps. Every screw, every latch was placed with precision, designed to work with gravity and momentum rather than force. He double-checked the setup, imagining the sisters climbing the ladder again, imagining the shock on their faces as events unfolded exactly according to plan. He allowed himself a small, private smile. They would believe they were acting freely, asserting their authority, yet every step they took would be guided by the careful preparation he had laid out. The thought was satisfying, not cruel, just the necessary enforcement of boundaries after months of entitlement and interference. As the afternoon approached, he noticed their SUV parked conspicuously near the driveway once more, a bold statement that they were still claiming dominance over his property. Susan and Lauren emerged from the house, each carrying a mix of tools and their habitual air of self-righteousness. Their movements were deliberate, calculated to convey confidence, though the traces of the previous incident lingered, a stiff posture, a flicker of hesitation in their eyes. They were walking directly into the environment he had prepared, unaware that the scene was no longer theirs to command. The man positioned himself partially out of sight, leaning against a corner of the garage where he could observe without interference. The wind carried faint sounds of their muttered planning, of scolding and strategizing between the sisters. Their voices were sharp, punctuated by irritation and fear, a combination that only reinforced his confidence in the unfolding scenario. The tension in the air was palpable, electric with anticipation, as the neighborhood seemed to hold its collective breath, invisible witnesses awaiting the next act. As the sisters approached the base of the ladder, he allowed his imagination to map the precise moment. The dish dislodged subtly, swinging or sliding under the influence of carefully measured weights. He anticipated the reflexive motions, the attempts to steady themselves, the instinctive reactions that would play perfectly into the plan. He did not need to intervene. The structure of their pride and their predictable aggression would do the work for him. All that remained was for them to move exactly as they had always moved in similar confrontations, rashly, arrogantly, without awareness of the consequences. From a distance, neighbors paused their routines, sensing the building suspense. A child on a bicycle slowed, craning neck to see what might unfold, while a woman in a sun hat paused mid-garden, her hands on the edge of a fence. The quiet hum of the suburban afternoon seemed to intensify the anticipation, each minor sound amplified in the charged atmosphere. A creak of the ladder, a faint clink of metal. The sisters murmured disagreements. Every detail fed the narrative, heightening the sense that something was about to occur and that the outcome would be inevitable once set into motion. The sisters ascended the ladder with the same confidence they had displayed 2 days earlier, unaware of the subtle changes, the invisible traps placed to exploit their pride. Their laughter and muttered assurances carried over the quiet street, a soundtrack of arrogance preceding inevitable consequence. The man remained still, muscles relaxed, but mind alert, fully aware of the stakes and the precision required to see the plan through. Each movement of the sisters brought them closer to the moment when past arrogance would meet present reckoning. As Susan reached for the satellite dish and Lauren steadied the ladder, the mechanism responded exactly as designed. The dish shifted imperceptibly at first, subtle enough that neither sister noticed, but deliberate enough to initiate the next sequence of events. The man held his breath, eyes fixed on the precarious setup. This was the point where timing, gravity, and human error converged into perfect synchrony. The narrative was building toward a crescendo, the suspense thickening with each second, and yet he remained a silent observer, letting the sisters' own actions dictate the climax. From across the street, the first hints of chaos stirred. The wind carried a faint metallic sound, a signal that the mechanism had begun its work. Susan's grip faltered ever so slightly, and Lauren's eyes widened in recognition of the subtle shift. It was the instant before consequence, the suspended moment where anticipation met inevitability. The man allowed himself the smallest smile, knowing the next moment would be transformative. The stage was set, the actors had played their roles, and the final act of this suburban drama was about to unfold. In that suspended second, everything hung on the brink. The sisters, oblivious to the invisible orchestration guiding their movements, were moments from discovering the outcome of their own arrogance. The man's mind traced the trajectory, calculating every inch, every potential deviation, confident that his plan would succeed without further intervention. And then, with a faint but decisive motion, the die had been cast. The narrative was poised to tip from tension to spectacular consequence, leaving the sisters exposed, the neighborhood watching, and the man ready to witness the fulfillment of a carefully orchestrated moment of poetic justice. The afternoon sun glinted sharply off the metallic surface of a satellite dish, casting a gleaming streak across the driveway as if marking the precise path of impending justice. Susan and Lauren, oblivious to the precarious alignment of the roof-mounted mechanism, adjusted their grip on the ladder. Their confidence, once unshakable, now carried the faint tremor of previous humiliation. The man remained hidden behind the corner of his garage, heart steady but pulse quickening with anticipation. Months of interference, endless complaints, and petty harassment had all led to this moment. The air was electric, thick with suspense, as neighbors instinctively drew closer, sensing the storm about to erupt. Susan reached toward the satellite dish, her fingers brushing the cool metal, exerting the force she believed would restore control. Lauren, positioned below, steadied the ladder with a grim sense of determination, eyes narrowed, jaw clenched, oblivious to the subtle shift of weights that had already begun. In that instant, time seemed to slow. The man watched, calculating the angles, imagining the precise point where the dish would break free and exact its vengeance. The world contracted to the narrow space between roof, dish, and driveway, a triangle of tension balanced on the sisters' arrogance and inattention. The first movement was subtle, almost imperceptible. The dish shifted slightly, teasing gravity's pull. Susan's eyes flicked toward it, confusion knitting her brows, but pride kept her hands firm. She muttered to Lauren, words lost in the rustle of leaves and distant traffic hum. The man exhaled quietly, his grin hidden behind his hand, savoring the anticipation. One wrong move, one faltering adjustment from the sisters, and the moment would arrive. Then it happened. A slight miscalculation, a finger sliding across the slick surface, and the satellite dish began its descent. There was a faint metallic whistle as it moved, gathering momentum. Susan's eyes widened, realization dawning too late. "Wait, no," she yelled, but gravity paid no attention. Lauren's arms flailed, attempting to steady the ladder, but her movements were frantic and ineffective. The neighbors froze, mouths agape, as the dish swung through the air, glinting violently in the afternoon sun. It struck the windshield of the gray Toyota SUV with a shattering crash that reverberated down the street. Glass exploded outward in a sparkling cascade, punctuated by the shriek of bending metal. Susan stumbled backward, hands covering her face, a high-pitched cry escaping her lips. Lauren's shriek of disbelief echoed over the driveway, her fingers still pointing, as though accusing the invisible hand that had orchestrated this outcome. The man stepped forward, unable to contain a burst of triumphant laughter, the sound booming in stark contrast to the sisters' despair. He surveyed the chaos, shards of green-tinted safety glass littering the hood, the satellite dish wedged cruelly across the windshield, and the once pristine SUV transformed into a testament of poetic justice. Susan sank to her knees, hands buried in her hair, muttering a string of words too incoherent to catch, while Lauren circled the vehicle, inspecting the damage with a mix of horror and denial. They had spent years believing themselves untouchable, confident in their self-assigned role as the neighborhood's moral arbiters. Yet here they were, utterly powerless. The man allowed himself a deep, steadying breath, savoring the precision of the moment. This was more than simple revenge. It was a lesson etched in metal and glass, a spectacle of consequence for arrogance unchecked. Neighbors emerged cautiously, some leaning from windows, others stepping into driveways, all drawn by the sound and spectacle. Phones appeared, capturing the destruction for posterity. The murmurs of astonishment and suppressed laughter spread through the street like wildfire. The sisters' plight became public instantly, their humiliation amplified not just by the physical damage, but by the collective gaze of the neighborhood. The man's laughter rang through the driveway again, though tempered now by satisfaction rather than surprise. The plan had executed flawlessly, a perfect intersection of timing, physics, and human folly. Susan finally lifted her head, eyes brimming with tears, meeting the man's gaze. You did this, she choked, voice cracking with a mixture of anger and fear. The man shook his head, his grin widening. No, he said calmly, this isn't about me. This is about choices. You made yours. Lauren, still circling the SUV, pointed accusingly, rage bubbling up uncontrollably. We'll see what the HOA says. You can't get away with this. The man's expression remained impassive, his calm a stark contrast to their chaos. He knew the evidence was undeniable, that the footage from his discreet cameras would leave the sisters exposed. Every accusation, every complaint they might lodge would be tempered by the physical reality of their actions. The sisters' SUV, once a symbol of their authority and pride, now served as a visual record of their failure. The man surveyed the scene with meticulous attention, dents aligned perfectly with the dish's trajectory, shards scattered in patterns that told the story of gravity, momentum, and their own hubris. He could almost hear the internal calculus of the sisters' minds, the frantic attempts to reconcile what had happened with their self-image. The irony was exquisite. The very object they sought to control, the symbol of their judgment, had become the instrument of their downfall. The afternoon deepened, shadows stretching across the driveway, and still the man stood, hands resting lightly on his hips, observing the aftermath. Susan's shoulders shook with silent sobs, while Lauren's defiance slowly eroded into stunned silence. The weight of public exposure, combined with the immediate destruction of property they cherished, created a palpable sense of defeat. The man allowed himself a subtle smile, knowing that the sisters' next steps would be cautious, measured, and inevitably constrained by the evidence of their own recklessness. As the neighbors continued to observe, a few brave souls stepped forward, offering words of cautious sympathy or quiet congratulations. The sisters did not respond, their attention entirely consumed by the wreckage and their disbelief. The man allowed the moment to settle, letting the consequences of their actions resonate fully. This was not mere vengeance. It was a demonstration of cause and effect, a lesson in accountability delivered in real time. The balance had shifted, and the sisters, once untouchable in their self-righteousness, were now humbled before the community. He walked slowly around the damaged SUV, careful to avoid the sharp fragments of glass, and reflected on the precision of the plan. Months of harassment, endless interference, and petty authoritarianism had all been met not with retaliation through force, but through clever orchestration and patience. The sisters had acted exactly as predicted, driven by pride and a desire to assert control, and the consequences had followed naturally. There was satisfaction in this, calm, measured, and complete. Karma had arrived not as a sudden explosion, but as an inevitable result of choices made without foresight. Susan finally rose to her feet, hands pressed against her abdomen, as if bracing for the reality she had refused to accept. Lauren, fingers still trembling, examined the roof, muttering about insurance and restitution, though the words fell flat amidst the visual evidence of their folly. The man stepped back, watching them reconstruct the magnitude of their error in silence, the street around them now buzzing with whispers, laughter, and incredulous glances. He felt a quiet pride, not in destruction, but in the demonstration of consequences, the clear and undeniable statement that arrogance unchecked would always find its reckoning. Yet even as satisfaction settled, he knew the story was not entirely concluded. The sisters would return, perhaps with complaints, legal threats, or desperate attempts to regain dignity. But the dynamic had shifted irrevocably. Their sense of invulnerability was shattered, replaced by a cautious wariness that would temper future actions. The man allowed himself one final look at the wreckage, the sunlight catching the shattered windshield and twisted dish, and felt a sense of closure tempered by anticipation. The first strike had landed, precise and complete, but the narrative, like all good stories, had more chapters yet to unfold. He straightened fully, brushing debris from his hands, and allowed a wry smile to cross his face. The lesson had been delivered. Pride had been punished, arrogance humbled, and the neighborhood reminded that actions always carry consequence. Susan and Lauren stood before their damaged SUV, their expressions a mixture of disbelief, anger, and grudging acknowledgement. The man took a final step back, watching as the sunlight slanted across the driveway, glittering off the remnants of shattered glass. For now, balance had been restored, but the tension lingered, the subtle promise of further encounters and resolutions still in the air. As the sisters finally retreated to their home, muttering under their breaths and avoiding the eyes of neighbors, the man allowed himself a long, measured exhale. The street resumed its quiet rhythm, though the energy of the afternoon lingered, a reminder that justice, when combined with patience, intelligence, and precision, could be both dramatic and satisfying. The satellite dish, the shattered glass, and the mangled SUV were more than symbols. They were evidence, proof that careful planning and observant patience could convert arrogance into spectacle. And while the immediate drama had concluded, the story's ripple effects would resonate, shaping future interactions and leaving a quiet, undeniable mark on everyone involved.